gotta get Arizona. If he gets Arizona and Nevada, it's a done deal for him. If he gets those two, and then, they didn't say anything about if he got those three little areas up there.
So is Arizona a swing state? Because last night he had it, and then it swung and it went to Biden.
But they've got, they left 600-something thousand votes unaccounted for.
But they
that
haven't
were-
called people.
No.
Hey, girl.
Hey,
Where you been
all
hiding?
right, I'm trying to see here now.
I've been wanting to see him and ask him, but I never saw him. Yeah, I did. I saw you Sunday. You were sitting on the other side.
I'm trying to remember.
And I didn't see you after church. I didn't look for you.
Ah, well, that's
And
what.
then, I just been getting ready for my dad to come visit.
Yeah,
I don't remember what was the Wednesday before that. Wasn't there a storm?
yeah,
Last
there was a
week?
hurricane. There was a
Okay,
hurricane.
that's probably.
Yeah.
We didn't come.
Why didn't it come? I don't know.
Oh,
No, we didn't have it last week.
I'm trying to had a party, I'm like, y'all.
you okay there, sir?
No, I don't know what's wrong with this thing this week. It's something different.
Oh, I was asking about your voice.
Hmm?
Your voice sounds a little hoarse.
Oh, yeah, I got something dripping.
I think everybody's going through that with all this weather change. Carter got mad at Riley earlier because the first thing she said was, "Can you taste and smell anything?" I don't have corona, Riley. I got a sinus infection.
Listen, I had a pain. Oh my God, Sunday. I couldn't even stand on this leg. And I was sitting there, I told Roman, I said, "Can you get the virus in your butt?" I just all of a sudden started hurting. It wasn't, I've been shopping all afternoon, and I did wear a wig that I hadn't worn in a long time. Oh, when that pain hit,
I got it on both sides, I know.
I was thinking about.
It's sciatica. I know what that
Don't
is.
name that, in Jesus' name. I
All
rebuke
right,
what
here
that
we
woman just said.
This
Oh.
is yours.
Stretches?
Yeah.
Okay, the neck was hurting over here when I got up. I knew that was wrong.
Copy.
So I knew that was okay, boy.
Oh, there
That
we are.
hurts, I know.
Yeah, stretch.
So what do you mean?
Okay.
Good.
Good.
Just don't tell me to do a somersault.
No. I'll show you why not, well,
I was thinking, I said.
everything's connected.
Cause
No,
my,
no.
my brother's, doing exercises for his pain.
I'll let you keep, well, if you don't grind, you'll be able to get up.
Well, I'll call him up.
Alright. So, this is the one.
I
You
can't
just,
believe shit.
you just lean forward,
She
that'll
cares.
stretch.
Oh my God.
Yep,
It's a nice little pulse.
Oh, that hurts worse than the pain.
it really doesn't.
Let me see.
Your knee is bent under.
I don't know if you can do that.
Good luck. You can do it on the chair. You can stand on the chair.
I know.
Oh, no, you haven't done that.
What are you doing?
It's not connecting again.
So, yeah.
It is, you know,
one leg
sometimes
goes here,
things
the
just
other
don't
leg goes
work.
behind you.
Oh, like that?
One leg in front of you, and then
But we're about to get it.
over you. So,
You'll
which
feel it.
one? Lean that way.
Well, it hurts back here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it'll, there's lean on.
Parallel to that knee.
Oh, well, that don't even hurt.
Straighten it out. You straighten it out.
All right.
We're doing physical therapy right now.
Yeah, we got all night.
Yeah, aim for there.
For those of you that are watching at home, we're teaching Ms. Ann how to stretch.
What do you do with these? Oh,
Speaking
Just hold them.
Yeah, wherever.
okay, so,
You feel it?
yeah.
Say nice.
No,
Oh, sorry. Well, I mean, it's stretching, so.
okay, now,
That's that muscle tension of when you bend down like that. It's because you're not used to doing all that.
I do some stuff in the morning.
You could do some, you could.
We're talking about bending down like that.
That's one stretch, and then your hamstrings are probably good. The thing with the hamstring is you really have to think about
That hurts
moving
right
your
here.
back.
Mhm.
Oh, don't hurt your knee.
Well, I mean, it's pulling right
Yeah,
I think it's because she's wearing pants.
yeah. So if you think about having a straight back, I like to put my hand back there, think about it, and then you uniform, it's a straight line.
Too far.
You can't go very far. Now, a lot of people will do this.
Yeah.
That's not doing it.
All right.
You ready?
Oh, I've been ready.
Yeah.
We got.
I just figured out that.
Yeah, you want some
I
help?
don't know if I
Oh,
can.
Gentle, gentle.
Have you a chair nearby? Oh, goodness.
So what does that do? Because I'm the pain subscription.
Are we still in
Sometimes
first
when
annual?
your muscles
Hmm.
are tight, they're
1 Samuel
pulling on
25
everything, which
is what we're gonna be
pulls on
doing.
nerves, so.
I was asking you about what translation you preach in the other day because that's what Mama wants to get daddy for Christmas.
Yeah. It's Christian Standard,
I hurt my back.
but you know, it's hard for me to stay in one for very long, so be ready to buy another one later. The New American Standard is,
I'm pretty much right with you, except for maybe a few words every once in a while.
what do you have?
That's why our shoulders are all hunched,
I have to have a case because when Christopher was
so.
3, he decided he wanted to color.
That's the NIV.
What is HCSB?
Roman Christian Standard. See, this was done on the heels of that one. Same people.
Yeah.
All right, 1 Samuel 25. Long chapter. A lot of not narrative. What am I trying to say? Dialogue. And whenever we find in the Hebrew text, when they use dialogue to introduce what's going on, they really want you to pay attention. There's nothing succinct about it. Everybody has a part to play. And the person with the least amount of dialogue is usually the one that's going to get it some sort of way. Either the one that is not speaking and is being spoken to, if they never respond, you pretty much know that they've been scolded in the process. They've been made to be made low. And then sometimes they even reach their demise. They may be killed in the process of this whole scene because they've been silent for some reason. So it's very important when we come across passages like this that are mixed with dialogue and narrative that we pay attention to the dialogue. Often in Old Testament literature, the narrator will describe what's being said as a way to kind of reduce the amount of material that's there. So this gives us a chance to kind of get into the characters a little bit more. And when that happens, there's always more to be learned. So that's what this makes available to us. So there's two things in this particular passage that are interesting. One is the whole motif of sheep shearing, which we see first. And then the second one is the whole process of taking a wife and what that means in the grand scheme of things. So I want us to talk just a little bit about that first, and then when we read it, you'll be able to see a little bit what's going on there. But there's the whole, we'll do the wedding first, since that's on my mind first. The whole wedding thing is all the way through the Old Testament. We see it first with Abraham finding a wife for Isaac. So he sends a servant, and the servant goes into the foreign country, and he goes to a well, and there's a woman there, and either she draws water or he draws water, and there's a dialogue that goes on, and then the woman or the ladies that are there at the well, they'll run back to town and they'll say that they found so and so, and after that there's a wedding. And in every one of those situations, it's established a royal lineage, so to speak. So we have it with Abraham finding a wife for Isaac, and then of course we have Jacob, who he goes and he winds up having 2 marriages, and they follow that same motif. And of course, on the second one, after his second marriage, he sneaks off from his father-in-law and he goes back home, and he finds himself to be the big man in the family, and is welcomed back by Esau rather than being killed by Esau and that whole thing that's going on. Okay, and then earlier in the passages with Saul, as he was becoming king, he had the same kind of thing, only it wasn't a marriage ceremony. He went looking for his donkeys. He comes upon the ladies at the well. Instead of asking for a woman, he's asking where he can find Samuel. And they direct him to Samuel. And Saul's lineage becomes what it is. He becomes king as a result of that. Then when we get to David and Michal, the same sort of thing happens, only it's not a water well. David shows up to take Michal's hand from Saul, and Saul says, "You've got to go shed blood." He wanted the foreskins of 100 Philistines, remember? Well, David comes back with 200, and he receives his bride for that price, and his kingship takes another step. So this motif of a wedding becomes very important. This whole thing of going, drawing from the well. Hey, Kevin. It's all right. Drawing from the well, the pronouncement of the one that has come, and then whatever happens after that, that is establishing the royal line, so to speak. Then there's another thing that happens 3 times in the Old Testament. One previously, this one, and then one later, that's built around sheep shearing. And the sheep shearing time was this big, wonderful time of the year. It was a big celebration. Everybody had worked all year to care for these sheep, and so now it was time to shear the wool, and everybody got paid, and it was just a fun time, Had a big party, everybody's eating, and that sort of thing. So we find in 3 different places, I'm going to have to look at my notes here. You recall Jacob, when Jacob kind of swindled Laban out of his flocks. He does that around sheep shearing time. So Laban had done what to Jacob? He had made him marry twice. He withheld his bride from him and had him marry the oldest daughter first with some trickery. And so he had to work another 7 years to receive the wife that he really wanted. Okay. And so when David got the chance at sheep shearing time, he makes that wrong right by fulfilling this whole plan that he had put together to mark the sheep where Laban believed that they were the bad sheep, and of course they weren't. It was just the way that Jacob had raised them. So Jacob makes the wrong that was done to him right during the time of sheep shearing, and it was the beginning of him going back home to become ultimately to continue on Abraham's line as the father of the Hebrew people. Then we see in this particular instance, David's a fugitive, and he's taken care of who is it? I forget his name. While they were out tending the sheep, David's men had provided protection for him. And so now David's come to collect his protection money, so to speak. And of course, Nabal won't have anything to do with it, calls him a runaway slave. And so David puts together this plan. He's going to go kill Nabal and all his offspring, all his male offspring. But then, of course, God intervenes, and some things happen where David is avenged, but not by his own hand, and it is another stepping stone in David's on his way to his kingship.
He's not king yet.
No, and then finally, Absalom, David's son, his half sister was raped, and raped by his whole sister was raped by his half brother and her half brother, and so nobody did anything about it. And so Absalom pretends like he's not going to do anything about it. But at sheep shearing time,
Sure.
he sheared him, got his revenge for his sister. And that begins the process of Absalom usurping the throne of his father. And so every time we see these stories, we see these events that mean more than just the story. We're able to see the bigger context because they've been writing about this for several hundred years in the same way. And we have clues as to what it will all mean in the end. And then, of course, that intertwines with other plots that come around, and we see how things either remain the same or change. In the midst of all of that, every time, there's God allowing his people or his servants to work things out. And we think sometimes, man, God's in control of everything. And he is. He's in control of being able to say, you're going to work this out. And so, when we do that, we certainly want to be behaving within the wisdom of God. We can work it out if our lives are before his, where whatever we have in our hand to do what we will do, God's placed it there, and not something that we've taken for revenge or for whatever reason. So I just wanted to go over those things so that when we look at these here, you can begin to see some of those themes that run through. Then the other thing is that not every marriage in the Old Testament follows that same pattern, because not every marriage brings about a step to being God's man or God's lineage or whatever God's doing. So that's another way that we can use these inferences. And when we really see it work the way it's supposed to, even though the elements may be moved around a little bit, we can see the intention that God has going on in it. See,
To the, I don't know how to say this. Do the marriages, you said, you answered it already. Just because there was a marriage doesn't mean that there was something to come after.
That's
that.
right.
It could be
That's
just
right. And the
they got
marriage
married,
itself,
but the people next to them got married and something great happened to them.
yeah. For instance, in Michael's situation, we have the situation with David shedding blood, much like the drawing of the water, and he's now in the king's house. But we see in this passage that King Saul takes the bride away from David, So Michael served her purpose. The marriage served its purpose.
For a short time.
For a time. Yeah. And so that's the way we have to look at these things. Yeah. Because we can get hung up on the whole idea, well, why in the world would David allow that, and why would Saul do that? Well, there's not a whole lot going on there other than that's the way God arranged for this to happen at the time. So that people can see. You can see what God is doing. You can experience it with him. Okay? So, and the other thing about the taking Michael, it is a way for Saul to ultimately say, you're dead to me, David. I've taken your life from our life. I've removed you from the royal family completely, even your wife. So anyway, Samuel died, and all Israel assembled to mourn for him, and they buried him by his home in Ramah. David then went down to the wilderness of Paran. A man in Maon had a business in Carmel. He was a very rich man with 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and was shearing his sheep at Carmel. The man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name Abigail. The woman was intelligent and beautiful, but the man, a Calebite, was harsh and evil in his dealings. So we have a great contrast of character here. Abigail, smart. Hey, um,
Not broadcasting today.
I am, but I've given up on that other thing. It doesn't work half the time. Until I get a smart IT guy, which is not me. We're doing it this way. So anyway, there's Nabal, and his name literally means fool. So I don't know who names their person that, but probably it's just a name given to him that best describes who he is. I don't know. I don't know if anybody calls him by his name. They refer to him as that, or they refer to him as an old fool. But he's very harsh and evil in his dealings. So while David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So David sent 10 young men, instructing them, go up to Carmel, and when you come to Nabal, greet him in my name. Then say this: long life to you, and peace to you, peace to your family, peace to all that is yours. I hear that you're shearing. When your shepherds were with us, we did not harass them, and nothing of theirs was missing the whole time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men; they will tell you. So let my young men find favor with you, for we have come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have on hand to your servants and to your son David. David's young men went and said all these things to Nabal on David's behalf, and they waited. So Nabal asked them, who is David? Who is Jesse's son? Many slaves these days are running away from their masters. Am I supposed to take bread, my water, my meat that I butchered for my shears and give them to these men? I don't know where they are from. So David's young men retraced their steps. When they returned to him, they reported all these words. He said to his men, all of you, put on your swords. So each man put on his sword, and David also put on his sword. About 400 men followed David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. So here we have this whole thing. Okay, David's a fugitive. He's living in the desert. Nabal's herdsmen were in the desert, allowing their sheep to graze there. And David, while they were there, they were all out there together, and they kind of took care of each other and looked after each other. And David had an army, so he provided protection to Nabal's flock while it was in the desert. So now it's shearing time, and David and his men need a few supplies. So he figures this is a good time to go get supplies from Nabal, because we've already helped him. Surely he will help us. And besides, this is the most vulnerable time for a man that's wealthy with sheep, because it's not easy to take a bunch of sheep, but it's real easy to take a bunch of wool. Okay, so he goes in and says, yes, surely he will do this. He'll see my 400 men and he'll realize, yeah, I need to do for David what David did for me. But of course he doesn't, because he's a fool. So one of the things that we begin to notice in this is that with Abigail and Nabal, we kind of find an alter ego of Saul presented here, which is a favorite thing for a Hebrew writer to do. They introduce a character that exhibits externally all the same things that the arch enemy exhibits. Only we've already seen in this case that David won't harm Saul, right? Because he's Saul's anointed. Okay? So it's like the only thing that's keeping David from killing Saul is the fact that Saul is God's anointed. But here's somebody just like Saul in every way. He's foolish, he's harsh, he's vindictive, he's only out for himself and ungrateful. And David, I can kill this guy. He's just like my enemy, and I can take him out, And he goes to do it. And of course, if he would have done it, everything that Nabal had, he would have stolen that day. So one of Nabal's young men informed Abigail, the wife. Look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, but he screamed at them. The man treated us very well. When we were in the field, we weren't harassed, and nothing of ours was missing the whole time we were living among them. They were a wall around us both day and night, the entire time we were with them herding the sheep. Now consider carefully what you should do, because there is certain to be trouble for our master and his entire family. He is such a worthless fool, nobody can talk to him. So Nabal is one of those people, even his herdsman realizes he's a fool. Does this sound familiar? When Saul got ready to kill the priest, and nobody would do it. You know, he had to get his hired hand, the who was it? Malachite? I forget who he was, or Cushite. He had to get him to do it because everybody that was really close to Saul recognized that he was losing his mind. The same thing's here. His servants that are close to Nabal realize this guy's off his rocker, you know. So here's all this dialogue. So Abigail, taking 200 loaves of bread, 2 clay jars of wine, 5 butchered sheep, a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she said to her male servants, "Go ahead of me, I will be right behind you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. All right. So in the story of Judah and Tamar, she what does she do? I can't think of the words tonight. She deceives Judah in order to get her prodigy, her son. So she has sex with her father-in-law so that her father-in-law can have a son to carry on his name, okay? Which turns out that that's the lineage that Jesus comes from. All right. So here we have Abigail deceiving her husband in order to provide for the king that would eventually, Jesus' line would come out of.
But she didn't know.
She didn't know that. But who does know that? God knows that. Yeah. So we don't hear about God in this chapter, but we see him working. And the way that we see him working is because we can find the breadcrumbs from other stories that come before this one to allow us to know what he's doing. Okay, so some of this stuff sounds outlandish, right? Daughter-in-laws, becoming pregnant by their father-in-laws, and, wives deceiving their husbands, and all these kind of things that are going on. But God knows the big picture, and he knows that we are going to make mistakes and make bad ones, but it doesn't stop what he's doing. See? And we have to understand that, because we have to be able to see where God's working all the time, not in just what is good, but also what is not so good in our eyes. It wouldn't have been good in their eyes, but it's what happened, and he's making it happen.
Well, another thing too I see in here with this Abigail was that there needed to be somebody that had some common sense.
Oh yeah.
Okay, she could see that her whole family was going to be annihilated, probably her as well, and that the husband wasn't going to be cooperative, and she saved her family and her husband from his own stupidity.
Right. And the other
So
thing,
having a level-minded person can always make the difference. God put her in that position.
yeah. And the other thing is, she parallels David in a lot of ways. David's the one that's practical and sly, and he's got a little mind about him to where he can, he's beginning to develop a sense of who he is so that he can not manipulate, but he knows how to use the situations that he's in.
He's still a kid, isn't he?
Yeah, well, pretty much, yeah. So there's a parallel there, and as David, and has already been acknowledged by Saul that David is there to take his throne. Saul knows already, he's already declared it in chapter 24 that that David's the true king. Abigail's kind of usurping her husband's place too. So they kind of carry this parallel. He's just a wealthy man. In fact, the word they use there is that he's a great businessman. He's made himself really rich by being a good businessman. You know, he may not have known anything about sheep herding, but he knew how to make money with sheep. So, so this is what's going on. So Abigail hurried. She took all these things. Then she said to her male servants, "Go ahead of me. I'll be right behind you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she rode the donkey down the mountain pass hidden from view, she saw David and his men coming toward her and met them. David had just said, and this is one of the things that I'm talking about between the dialogue and the narrative. The narrator could have told us what David said, but he is introducing a dialogue which builds a relationship between David and Abigail, which becomes important. "I guarded everything that belonged to this man in the wilderness for nothing. He was not missing anything, yet he paid me back evil for good. May God punish me and do so severely if I let any of his males survive until morning." So he's saying this to his men, and she overhears this. So here's this great scene going on. But she's able to eavesdrop in on what David is thinking and what David is saying. So when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off the donkey and knelt down with her face to the ground to pay homage to David. So the significance of that is a woman never does that if she's married unless her husband is there. But here she is totally taking control, like we're saying, totally taking control of the situation. She has assumed the role of the head of the house because she's now just surrendered herself to the king. Now she don't know he's a king, or does she? Because when we get into her speech, we find out that she knows more than she's let on, or that we've been let on. She knelt at his feet and said, "The guilt is mine, my lord, but please let your servant speak to you directly." So she takes the blame for her husband. She's taking total control of the whole situation. "Listen to the words of your servant. My lord should pay no attention to that worthless fool Nabal, for he lives up to his name." Okay, his name means worthless fool. His name means stupid, and stupidity is all he knows. Now you got to think this is kind of comical when you're coming across this in God's word, and everybody's calling this guy stupid and a fool, and it's all that he knows. Now he's a successful businessman. We already know that from when we first were introduced to him. He's made a lot of money with sheep. I mean, the word that they use to describe him is that he's very successful in business, but he's a stupid fool. Okay, so we can learn a lot about people. Just studying Nabal a little bit. Just because you're rich and you're able to be a good businessman doesn't really mean that you've got it all together in life completely. See, so that's kind of what's coming across here. "I know your servant didn't see my lord's young man whom you sent. Now, my lord, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, it is the Lord who kept you from participating in bloodshed and avenging yourself by your own hand. May your enemies and those who intend to harm my Lord be like Nabal." So she's saying, thank goodness you didn't soil your hands with this man's blood. And so then she says, "I hope and pray that every enemy you ever have is as stupid and worthless fool as this one is, so you'll never have to shed blood because they're just so ridiculously stupid." All right, isn't this amazing? That's what's going on here. And this is his wife, okay? But she's totally taken control of the whole situation.
Trying to save it?
Yeah, she is trying to keep from losing all she has. And in the process, she's got to save her stupid, foolish husband because he's not wise enough to do it himself.
Wow.
Okay, so this sounds crazy, right? That why was this story in Scripture? I mean, where is the place where you point to Jesus in this? You can't really find that in
Well,
this.
you have to read this to get to that.
Well, you do. You're being introduced to a very smart, clever woman, Abigail.
She got
Okay.
something up her sleeve.
Well,
on her own way.
she's unknowingly preparing herself for something that she doesn't know is coming at the time. So she has proved herself to be the opposite of her husband. He unknowingly proved himself to be who he was at the time, and it nearly got him killed. She unknowingly is proving herself to be who she is, and as we will see, she becomes David's wife. Okay. So remember the marriage motif and how it's a step toward the throne. Every time we see this, it's to establish a royal lineage. So now, not only does David have the love of the people, well, we get to the end, not only does David have the love of the people, he has the confession of the current king that he's going to be king. Now he's wealthy. So everything's lining up to make him what God said he will be. So if God has said it, he's ordained it, then all of this, is it an accident? No. No. So we have to learn to read these things to see God's hand in what, because where do we find God in this story other than it's his providence for David? And so everything's working for David. And we started talking about that, and it continues to be true, and it never ends and is never not true until we get to the Bathsheba story. And in everything that God had rolled into him, we see unravel, and we think it's going to be the end, but it's not. So we're way ahead, but that's the beautiful part of all this. So let's see. Please forgive my servant's offense, for the Lord is certain to make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because he fights the Lord's battle. So now she is recognizing you are the Lord's man, and you're fighting the Lord's battles. Okay? Throughout your life, may evil not be found in you. So she is offering nearly a prophetic word for David in his life. And is she doing all of this just to save her hide? She's gone a little bit far, don't you think? So there's an inspiration here that we are not privy to having witnessed on her, but she certainly is, because she recognizes David as a king. And nobody yet knows that David's supposed to be king, except for David now, because Samuel's passed away, and Jonathan, he never knew, but he's off the scene now completely. Someone is pursuing you and intends to take your life. My Lord's life is tucked safely in the place where the Lord your God protects the living, but he is flinging away your enemies like stones from a sling. So tell me, man, the Hebrew writers. Great.
Some people just sit there and let the world pass them by. And other people pay good attention to everything that's going on. So this woman, she knows that he's been anointed. She knows that he killed the Philistine. She knows that he's going to be the king of Israel because she's been paying attention. Her eyes are open. She's not asleep like most of them are asleep.
Yeah.
Like her husband is asleep. He doesn't realize. He hasn't been paying attention. He hasn't seen all the heard, because this isn't that big a region. All this, word of mouth goes far.
Well, right. When you're hanging out with 600 of your guys.
He's the one sitting at the gate. Okay, so like Trevor says, you sit at the gate so that you can judge what the market is.
Right.
Okay, she probably also did that with her husband. She probably said, well, this is a fool and he's rich and I can marry him and have control of him.
Yeah, that may have been out of heaven.
She's wise enough to see the situation. She can position herself where she can profit best.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, whether she be good or evil,
Right.
she still has an extreme amount of intelligence, and they don't expect that from a woman in this time of day.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, she's taking total control. David is negotiating with a
God's
woman.
using her in a mighty
Yeah,
way.
he's using her. He's using her because
So
when all this is
hopefully she's
over,
rich.
we're going to see that the fate that comes upon Nabal ultimately comes upon Saul, and everything does pass to David, just like it does here in this story. So you've got a microcosm, and this is what when I finally figured out how to read this stuff, it opened my eyes because here's a microcosm of the big story that we're able to look at and gain all sorts of clues about where God is leading the whole thing. So verse 30 says, when the Lord does for my Lord all the good he promised you and appoints you ruler over Israel, there will not be remorse or a troubled conscience for my Lord because of needless bloodshed or my Lord's revenge. And when the Lord does good things for my Lord, may you remember me, your servant. So, boy, she laid out a great speech there. I mean, she hit all the high marks. Yeah, she gets a 98. It really is good.
Great. To come up against an army of 400 men.
Yeah, she shut it down.
Or is that 4,000?
No, 400.
400
Yeah.
men, and just lay it out, well, first of all, she's a woman, she shouldn't have said a word anyway.
She was a beautiful woman. That's the part that we've kind of glossed over here. Then David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord God of Israel who sent you to meet me today. So their meeting is reason to bless the Lord. Okay, so this is a great moment in David's life because you didn't just bless the Lord for any reason. So we sneeze, God bless you. We don't even know we did it. We don't even know what we said. But when you have an event in your life where you're able to look to God and say, you are a blessed God. I bless you, God, for what you've done in my life. That's what this means. Okay. May your discernment be blessed. All right. He's talking straight to her wisdom. And may you be blessed. Today you kept me from participating in bloodshed and avenging myself by my own hand. Now this is an important theme. This is twice that we've spoken of avenging by my own hand, or she said avenging by your own hand, and that becomes significance. It doesn't mean that a vengeance is not coming. It just means that David's been protected from it. He still remains, he keeps all the qualifications he needs to be king. Because even though Nabal did not provide the food and supplies for David, he didn't deserve to die because of it. It's his stuff, So he didn't deserve to die because of it, but David was ready to kill him because of it. So this whole thing becomes a stopgap in a lot of ways, because now we find that Abigail is functioning not only as Nabal's wife, but she's functioning as kind of a messenger of God for David, unknowingly. That happens by God too. Okay, so then he goes on. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord lived, prevented me from harming. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord God of Israel lives, who prevented me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me. So he's saying, I would have killed you too. Nabal wouldn't have had any males left by morning light. So here we have this theme again of when the priest, I can't remember his name, his whole male line was wiped out. His lineage was gone at the hands of Saul, and David was about to perform the same, really, injustice. The only reason why it was just before was why? Because God told Eli that your entire line is going to be wiped out, to be no priest left in your family.
And he has
Yes. I can't, it's terrible. I can't remember anything tonight. No sleep last night. I guess I was doing what y'all were doing. Yeah.
You stay up and watch that SpongeBob?
Well, I watched, I watched it till about,
Too long.
I was dozing. By about 1:30, I was out already, all the way. I just kept waking up thinking, nah, it's gotta be over. Nothing changed. Then David accepted what she had brought him and said, go home in peace. See, I have heard what you said and have granted your request. So now the wise lady has changed the path of a king. Then Abigail went to Nabal, and there he was in his house holding a feast fit for a king. Oh man. Can you just can't get past the irony, right? You can't get past the irony. Nabal's heart was cheerful and he was very drunk. So she didn't say anything to him until the morning light. So she lets us go all night what she had done. She doesn't want to tell Nabal that she has saved his life. Okay. Even though he's foolish, part of his foolery is he really thinks he can handle anything. And he thinks he's already handled this the right way. So she's thinking, well, maybe when he's coming off a drunk, where his head's banging and he's not thinking very well, she can just slip it in there and he'll let it go. In the morning when Nabal sobered up, his wife told him about these events. His heart died and he became a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal dead. So for 10 days, he's in this stupefied trance. Remember, anybody ever see Little Abner? The old musical Little Abner? Oh no, y'all hadn't seen him. There was a guy in there called Stupefied Jones, and he had an evil eye, and he'd look at you, and you'd go like this. You'd freeze like a stone. It came right out of this story, I found out later. Yeah. So his heart died. Imagine that kind of language. It's really great. It's not talking about his physical heart. Man, everything that Abigail did destroyed him as a man. His identity, his soul, killed him. He didn't know how to live life anymore. His wife, the woman of the house, had not only gone behind his back, but saved his life, saved her life, saved all his stuff. And he didn't know how to deal with it.
Yeah,
So-
version says that he had a seizure and became paralyzed.
Yeah.
He had a seizure and became paralyzed.
Yeah, and then it says he did this for 10 days, and after 10 days, the Lord strikes him dead. It's like 10 days was enough. I'm just going to strike him dead and get this over
He knew
with.
he wasn't working, gonna be working, anybody.
Well, he couldn't still be, if she was gonna marry David, she couldn't still be
Yeah.
married to him, so
See-
God worked that out.
This is all part of the whole motif I was describing earlier. So David comes, and the woman of the house brings gifts to David. Okay? So it's not a well that they come to draw water, but what happens is Nabal dies. So David is in a very symbolic way, able to draw water. Okay? There's no bloodshed, but he draws all the wealth. Okay? Because what does he do? There's a marriage now. The way's been cleared for this marriage to happen. Blessed be the Lord who championed my cause against Nabal's insults and restrained his servant from doing evil. The Lord brought Nabal's evil deeds back on his own head. So here we have the old eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth type thing creeping into David's theology here. And of course, this becomes prophetic because the same thing happens to David. Okay. It's almost these very words, just in different nouns and pronouns. It's the same thing when David says, my evils come back upon me. Then David sent messengers to speak to Abigail about marrying him. Okay. When David's servants came to Abigail at Carmel, They said to her, David sent us to bring you to be to him as a wife. So this harkens back to Abraham sending his servant and all the different stories that we have leading up to this. She stood up, paid homage with her face to the ground, and said, Here I am, your servant, a slave to wash the feet of my Lord's servants. So she's already won over David's people too. Very clever. Then Abigail got up quickly, and with her 5 female servants accompanied her, rode on the donkeys following David's messengers, and so she became his wife. And then this little 43 and 44, it feels like it's just thrown in here, but it's really not. It says, David also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and the 2 of them became his wives. So David's got 2 wives.
They've got a harem going on.
Yeah, which is a qualification for a king. Except for Saul, and Saul may have, but they all had harems at the time. They all had more than 1 wives. I don't know. I don't know why anybody wants to do that.
It's a
But,
possession, it's a display of wealth.
Is there any significance?
Well, when we look at the geography, there could be some significance. David is solidifying a buffer around what will eventually become Jerusalem, is the seat of the capital. So it could be that. Could be that it was a similar type of thing where David's able to pick up some wealth or make a political allegiance. We just don't know because we don't know anything about
Well, the whole thing
this
harems,
lady's family.
There's a lot of wars going on in this story, a lot in this whole region. So there's probably a whole lot more women than there are men.
Oh, there's definitely that. There's always been that.
So because of all the men dying in wars, the ones that are alive have to accommodate, more lives.
Yeah. So we don't know. We just know that it's here. They had
And
2
then
wives.
Isn't there rules about if your brother dies, you have to marry his
Oh,
brother?
that's a whole different thing. That was a Hebrew rule, so that all you had was geography and genealogy. If you had no genealogy, you had no geography. So the requirement was if your brother died and had not left an heir, then his brother would try to leave an heir for his brother, his deceased brother, by having a child with his widow. And that way, that family was able to maintain possession, because without a male heir, you couldn't maintain possession. Hence the whole Ruth and Naomi story. So that was a very important thing. So Moses allowed for that. But that strictly had to do with the possession of the land. By the time Solomon is king, he's made this into a great political art. He had 600 and something wives.
Oh, gee,
Had them everywhere.
he probably did.
Well, it doesn't mean that he was prolificating with all of them, but it does mean that he had them. Anyway. But Saul gave his daughter Michal to David's wife, to Palti, son of Laish, who was from Gallim. So he's kind of building him he takes David's wife, since now David has 2. Saul hears about it and he says, no, he's dead to me for sure now. He doesn't even have my daughter as a wife anymore. Because David had, remember in chapter 24, David had said, when he called out Saul after he cut the corner off his robe, he called him my Lord, my King, and my Father.
Mm-hmm.
And even before that, Ahinabeb, the priest, had said, how did I offend you, King Saul? I mean, David's your son-in-law. So that's been a theme that's been a part of David's life up until this point. Now that's over, because it doesn't serve anybody any purpose anymore.
So he never really married her? He was kind of
Oh,
set to marry her? Or?
no, they were married, but the king's the king, like Mel Brooks says, and one of those stupid movies he made. It's good to be the king. You get to make all the decisions. And that's what he did here. And he's probably building a political alliance um, with this Palti guy.
Was it a status thing to have that many wives?
I don't
The
know.
guy that had 600?
I think it was. I think it was like it was. During the monarchies in Europe, they had wives, and then they all had concubines, and they would be from different countries. And if you had a concubine in your court that was, say you were from France and she was from England, then that may satisfy some political interest that they had with England in some sort of way.
Some sort of trading.
Yeah, like a treaty or something like that. And this was an acceptable practice at that time. And to not get into too big of a detail, but then when the church became involved in monarch affairs, that became a big no-no. And so they had to find other ways to get around that. See, and so but here, fair game. He thinks fair game. It was because a woman still was a possession. That's what makes Abigail stand out like a shining star, because she never behaved. She never does behave as one who is possessed by another. She understands her identity. She understands her sense of self, her creativity, her intellect. She understands all of that, and she uses all of it. There's not a better picture in Scripture, really. Esther's another one. We never hear about God's never mentioned in the book of Esther, but you see him working, and you see him working through Esther because she's so clever and she's brave, and the same thing here. You don't see a lot. The narrator doesn't mention God, and he doesn't come into the scene, but you see how God is having an effect through her in these scenes. So good role models to look at. So in 26, we have some of the same story that we have in 24, right? So Saul is chasing after David. He winds up camping down on this plain, and David's up in the mountains. And so David sent out spies and knew where Saul was in the camp. And he's right in the middle of the camp. And everybody is sleeping around Saul. So, yeah, they're all asleep. And so David went to the place where Saul was camped. He saw the place where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of his armies, were laying down. Saul was lying inside the inner circle of the camp with the troops camped around him. Then David asked Ahimelech, the Hethite. Ahimelech was the priest, by the way, the son of the priest that escaped. And he's make sure we don't confuse him. He's a Hethite. And Joab's brother, Abishai, son of Zeruiah. Zeruiah is the husband of David's sister. So he's got his nephew with him and another guy. This is Ahimelech. Who will go with me into the camp to Saul? I'll go with you, answered Abishai. Okay, so his nephew goes with him. That night, David and Abishai came to the troops, and Saul was lying there asleep in the inner circle of the camp with his spear stuck in the ground by his head. Abner and the troops were lying around him. Then Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy to you. Let me thrust the spear through him into the ground just once. I won't have to strike him twice." There they are in the middle of this camp having this conversation about killing the king, and nobody's able to hear because they're sound asleep. We find out at the bottom of this, God's done this. He's delivered them
Well,
to
it's
him.
the same thing in 24. Saul was asleep.
Well, he wasn't asleep. He was doing his business.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
But he still could have killed him.
Yeah.
He still could
Oh,
have
yeah,
killed
he
him
could have
right
killed him.
there.
Yeah, he could have killed him. Instead, he cut the robe, and he said, I'm taking, that was symbolic of what? Usurping the throne. That was to insult his royalty by taking that. You're taking it from him. Here, what happens? Okay, but David said to Abishai, don't destroy him, for who can lift a hand against the Lord's anointed and be innocent? Okay, so you can't. David just discovered, I can't even lift my hand against a foolish man, and
Yeah,
began to
that's
say,
some deep spiritual stuff.
Yeah.
Next minute he's gonna kill him, but he couldn't kill him right then.
yeah,
We'll get him on the way out.
yeah, well,
But he spiritually knew he couldn't do that, because he was anointed.
2 reasons. He's anointed. I'm not going to kill him because he is anointed and because of my innocence. I'm not going to harm him or me. Okay. And for Habishi to do it would have been silly to say that, well, he did it. If he did it, then he should be king. You see? So you can't do it for David. So David's in control and doing the right thing. As the Lord lives, the Lord will certainly strike him down. Either his day will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. So the Lord's either going to strike him, or he's just going to die of old age, or he's going to die in battle. However, because of the Lord, I will never lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. Instead, take the spear and the water jug by his head, and let's go. Now, we get a little more insight into this that we didn't get in the last story. He says, however, because of the Lord. Okay, so it's not because Saul is God's man, so to speak. He's been anointed king, but it's because of the Lord. So the focus now for David is in the right place. He didn't shed innocent blood with Nabal, and it was because Abigail, in effect, a prophet, speaking the truth to David's innocence and what shedding blood would do to him. David learned that lesson, and he's saying, it is because of the Lord. He's protected my innocence in not killing Nabal, and he's also protecting my innocence here. And I'm not going to dishonor the Lord because Saul is his anointed. Not that I'm going to dishonor Saul by taking his life. So the focus is not on Saul, it's on the Lord. And that's an important part of the story. However, because of the Lord, I will never lift my hand against. I just read that. So they take the spear and the water jug, which represents, the spear represents what? Death. Water represents what?
Life.
He holds both, see, in his hand. In fact, it says in the Hebrew, God placed in his hand, or he placed in his hand the spear and the water jug. So David took the spear and the water jug by Saul's head, and they went away. No one saw them, no one knew, no one woke up. They all remained asleep because of a deep sleep from the Lord came over them. So again, we don't know this. David doesn't even know this. This is a narrator sharing something with us. Okay? There was every opportunity. God had given David every opportunity. So it's a test at the same time. God said, all right, they're going to sleep soundly through this whole thing. If David decides to kill him, he'll kill him. Nobody's going to be there to stop him. And David does what David does. So then David shouted to the troops and to Abner, son of Ner. So they stood at the top of the mountain. They'd come down. They got back to the mountain, and he's yelling at Abner. Abner's the chief of Saul's army. And Abner, we're introducing Abner now, the way so many have been introduced before. They've got a little part in the story here, but Abner's role becomes bigger later. He says, Abner, son of Ner, aren't you going to answer, Abner? Aren't you going to answer? Who are you who calls to the king? And David called to Abner. You're a man, aren't you? Who in Israel is your equal? So why didn't you protect your lord the king when one of the people came to destroy him? So he's dressing down Abner here. Okay. Who should be dressing down Abner?
The king.
Yeah, well, the king is. That's what the writer's trying to get us to see. See?
You shouldn't even be alive.
David is performing as king to Saul's own army. David called to Abner, you're a man, aren't you? Who in Israel is your equal? So why didn't you protect the Lord from the king, of the Lord the king, when one of the people came to destroy him? What you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, all of you deserve to die, since you didn't protect your Lord, the Lord's anointed. Now look around. Where's the king's spear and water jug that were by his head? And so here, man, he's called out Abner, and he's called out the whole army.
So wait, they're supposed to be sleeping.
They were sleeping, but
Half the money sleeping.
they were all sleeping. Because God put a deep sleep on them. So when David gets to the top of the mountain, he starts yelling, and they wake up. Yeah. So again, as in 24, Saul recognized David's voice and asked, "Is that your voice, my son David?" Yeah, see, yeah. Very insincere, right? It is my voice, my Lord and King, but notice David leaves out. Yeah. Then he continued, "Why is my Lord pursuing your servant? What have I done? What crime have I committed? Now may my Lord the King please hear the words of his servant." And so we got a little inner parenthesis here, quotation marks. If it is the Lord who has incited you against me, then may he accept an offering. Meaning that if the Lord has incited you against me, I am ready to make an offering to the Lord. So what he's saying is, I want fellowship, I want peace, I want a peace offering. And the way that people achieved that with one another was to go to the temple or to go to the town, wherever it was, and they offered this peace offering first to God, and then they enjoyed the meal with one another. But if it is people, may the Lord be cursed in the present. May they be cursed in the presence of the Lord. Meaning, if people have caused you to think that I've done you harm and that you should kill me, then they should be cursed in the presence of the Lord. For today they have banished me from sharing in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go and worship other gods. So what he's saying here is, if it is people, they should be cursed, because I've been run out of my home country. And I'm over here with a bunch of pagan gods in this pagan land, and I'm not able to worship. So here we have David's reasoning for being so upset about being pursued is not because he's without a home and not because he's no longer a part of the royal household. He cannot properly worship. So I mentioned earlier about geography and geology. The geology of the Hebrew people was terribly important because it was the promise. They saw the promise of God as the promise of the land. And God was to be with them there. So remember, God tells them that that's where he's going to be with them. And if he's not on the land, he can't be with his God. He can't worship. That's the way they thought about things. Okay. So worship is important to David in this. He has been too long without that kind of experience. I wish people thought about that today. People go months without worshiping. I don't get it. So don't let my blood fall to the ground far from the Lord's presence, meaning don't kill me here. For the king of Israel has come out to search for a single flea, like one who pursues a partridge in the mountains. He says, I'm so insignificant. Why are you doing this? Now, I forget the name of the partridge, but it's a small bird about the size of that can that doesn't fly in the desert. And it would run. And the way that you killed one is you ran it till it couldn't run anymore. They'd give out. You run them 400 or 500 yards and they'd give out, and knock them on the head, and that was supper. And so he's saying, I mean, that's the kind of, there's no sport in this. There's no reason for this. I'm just an old partridge in this desert. I'm a flea on the back of the partridge in the page, you know. So don't waste your time with me. So Saul responded, I have sinned. He's the second time he's admitted to that because of this. Come back, my son David. I will never harm you again, because the day you considered my life precious. I have been a what?
A fool.
A fool. Nabal. I've committed a grave error. Now see the difference between being anointed by God and not being anointed by God? God anointed Saul, and there's a proper time that God will remove that anointing and Saul will be taken out. Nabal never enjoyed any anointing. See,
Well, God's gonna take care of it anyways. But if David had shed blood with Nabal, he would have had no problem killing the king.
yeah,
He
well,
would already had the taste of blood. He would have saw the sense, okay, this is a fool, I kill fools, so I'm just gonna kill another fool.
yeah, and it would have changed everything
He
because,
couldn't do it. God wouldn't let him.
right. That's the remarkable thing about all
He
this,
crossed
isn't it?
his mind.
Yeah,
Well, when you fall into the habit of sin, you've already lost.
yeah, that's right.
So, you know, if he would have been taking an innocent life
Yeah, blood
prior
begets
to
blood.
this, then he would have already been stained by that sin.
Yeah, yeah. David could have killed Saul, and the army would have followed him,
He couldn't.
but he couldn't.
Yeah.
That's right.
Why are we discussing that?
Good question.
Because he was playing by the rules, even if Saul wasn't.
That's right. Saul had no, God's hand had been taken from Saul. He had no direction at all. He had no bearings. He had lost his mind. And David is constantly building his as it relates to God having his way with
David would
him.
have broke the anointing on himself.
Yes.
How old is Saul?
Saul's getting older now. He's probably in his late 40s. Yeah, and David is too. He's in his late 20s. They're only a few years apart, really. We think about Saul being old, and we do that because most of the movies that we've ever watched that has Saul in it, he's an old white-haired gray man, but it doesn't really depict him very well. Middle-aged, well, maybe younger. I still think of myself as middle-aged. So David answered, "Here is the king's spear. Have one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord will repay every man for his righteousness and his loyalty." So here's a little proverb that exists in here. This is a saying. David is claiming God's blessing and righteousness because he's been loyal to the king. "I wasn't willing to lift my hand against the Lord's anointed, even though the Lord handed you over to me today. Just as I considered your life valuable today, so may the Lord consider my life valuable and rescue me from all trouble." So David says, because God has taught me, trained me to be merciful, and I've exercised that mercy, I pray that God will also be merciful with me. Okay? So David doesn't ask for God's mercy first. He demonstrates what he has learned about mercy from God and those that have been around him. He exercises what he learns so that then he is able to receive God's righteousness. Now, why is that important? And the reason why that is important is because when we are exercising a particular thing, like mercy, then we are able to recognize it when it does come our way in a significant way. How is God being merciful to me? It may not be pleasant, his mercy, but as we live it, we are able to identify it more readily as it comes to us from God. And that's true of anything that we expect to receive from God, righteousness. How do we truly recognize God's righteousness as a part of our life? When we've been able to live what we've already been taught about it. God doesn't leave us in our ignorance. Only we can leave ourselves in our ignorance by ignoring it, by callousing it over, by making excuses, all the things that we sometimes do. So then we miss what God really has in store. Saul said to him, "You are blessed, my son David." He keeps going back to my son thing the whole time. You will certainly do great things and will also prevail. Then David went his way and Saul returned home. So the first time Saul, and when this in the story declared David king, you certainly will be king. Okay. But he never calls David his son except in the first time that he speaks. Here he calls David his son every time.
Maybe
Okay.
he's in denial that he's not his son anymore.
Well, or could it be this? He's trying to claim David's kingship by calling him his son. Jonathan is his son. He's got a son. David's no longer can even be called his son-in-law because he's taken his wife from him. So what Saul is doing here, and what the narrator is doing for us, is allowing us to see that not only has Saul declared in chapter 24 that David will be king, now Saul is trying to even identify himself with David as David being from the lineage of Saul.
One book said,
It's a last little pitiful effort.
it says, one book said Saul continued to pursue David, but they never saw each other again.
Yeah, after this, this is a big, when we get to 27, there's a change in the story. And we begin to see a lot of things happen differently. And really we're at a point where it must, because this can't go on forever, right? I mean, there's got to be an end. We've nearly discovered all the plot and subplot that's going on. Jonathan's no longer in the scene. Samuel's gone. Saul is all but succumbed to David's leadership. David has become wealthy. He's establishing some boundaries around Israel through different alliances, and so we're approaching that time where kingship and a national capital and uniting all the clans is right on our doorstep. And then that'll be then we'll be getting into 2 Samuel here real soon. And then it all picks up. It gets really exciting. So when we'll take our time through 2 Samuel, and then when we get in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, that's gonna take a little bit of time. Because what I intend to do is parallel those passages because they parallel. And then as we are introduced to prophets along the way, if there's a work by those prophets, we'll go back and take a brief look at what kind of influence that had. We won't study the prophets, but we'll just look at their influence and how that all worked out and what God's purpose was through them and the various means that he speaks through them. But we'll stay on track with the history part and just try to integrate all that. And I'm trying to find a really good timeline that has everything on one page. And I think I found one. I just have to get it printed at a print shop or something. It doesn't print too good on my old jalopy. I got a printer that's as old as me in printer years.
Technology, we need a.
Yeah, it's about 70-something years old.
Wait a
Printer
second,
years.
Yes,
Yeah.
Brother David.
Brother David? No, don't do
I have
that.
a-
Bye, y'all.
I have a feeling that God's telling me that I need to pray for the situation.
Okay,
So if y'all
absolutely.